So it's recording. I want to welcome you all, and I start by thanking Martin Gak, who accepted my invitation. We know each other for some decades now, in the plural.
That's not nice of you, Marta.
So we met at the New School. Martin Gak has a PhD in philosophy, and he was always interested and passionate, I would say, about the relationship between ethics and politics and religion, and basically the question of values and human life. Martin has been a producer in German television, Deutsche Welle. He's also a religious affair correspondent, and he's been working for several years now in the media, in several media organizations, and is writing a new book on wokeism, right? So thank you, Martin. And you'll be talking today on totalitarianism and dissent, intellectual crimes of conscience. So we will let you speak, and at the end we will most certainly ask several questions and engage in the discussion.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Marta. It's been indeed many years that we've known each other. Yeah, I mean, thanks a lot for the invitation. There's been, I must say that it's very encouraging to see a lot of conferences and a lot of events taking place with, at academic and non-academic levels of people discussing basically what I have to admit that for me were more or less settled issues. I mean, I was born in Argentina in '74. It's not my fault. Just want to get that out of the way. And I grew up sort of the first political memories I have are the memories of the immediate aftermath of the military dictatorship, which took somewhere in the order of, well, anywhere between 10,000, 30,000 people and produced torture chambers and whatnot. And that is kind of the pornography of violence that came out of that period. But the one that is a bit buried underneath the pornography of violence is the amount of prohibition and the amount of limitations to freedom of speech and so on. I should just warn you, I have a 2.5-year-old baby sort of a room away, so there is a chance that you will hear him or that I will be interrupted to actually show him more cartoons. Home office. So what was hidden underneath that pornography of violence, and I think it was the more, not only more interesting, but it was actually the preamble to the horrors of violence, was the systematic production of prohibition and interdictions. And these prohibitions were prohibitions that were not particularly concerned with grand narratives. It's not that one was forbidden from killing people on the street, which of course was forbidden, but this is not what the law that was built around 76 when the military government comes into power and suppresses the Argentinian constitution in a way that is actually itself very interesting. They did not eliminate the constitution. The junta essentially set up 3 or 4 national emergency laws that they claim superseded the constitution. So the constitution became essentially subjected to these 4 principles, which were the principles of what they called national reorganization. And of course, those gave primacy to military concerns. What was interesting about it is that the prohibitions that came with that were prohibitions about sort of very menial things, where of course all the things that one would imagine with sort of sexual morality from the extreme right, so sort of laws against homosexuality and sodomy and so on and so forth. But there was also a question of the kind of things that you were reading, and there was a question about the kind of things that you could sing, and there were questions about what kind of things you could believe in, what kind of history you could buy. I mean, as a matter of fact, there was, and this has been well known sort of in regimes that came out of the right, as in regimes that came out of the left. I mean, this was well known in Eastern countries. I live now in a place which which was part of the communist machine, the KGB operated here, were the listings of books that had been taken out by particular individuals from libraries or that had been bought. So the thing that was to me, very interesting about these processes was that by the time that democracy came back, I think, along with many in my generation, and I can say this without a doubt about my friends. I mean, I grew up pretty much every summer for 10 years, 3 months a year in Brazil. So Brazil for me remains even now my second home. I mean, I really consider Brazil to be the place where where not only like a lot of my ideas were formed, my aesthetic dispositions. I mean, I have a father who was a religious seller of Vinicius de Moraes. This is not a joke. There was really this kind of like almost a dogmatic commitment. Whatever Vinicius did was fine. The point of this is that my sense of what my friends and my acquaintances and my environment in Brazil, and the same thing I can say for Uruguay, the intuitions that sort of emerged towards the mid 80s were very, very similar, was that there was something that had been completely amiss, and to which we were never going to be going back. We understood that basically telling people who they could get laid with, who they could, read, what they could sing, were things that essentially paved the way by force of criminalization to extreme acts of violence. Because I think that this is sort of, for me, I mean, it's a very interesting way to formalize the question of what a totalitarian drift is. And I should make sort of a short mention here to two historical matters, which is, the first one is Hannah Arendt, whose book on Eichmann is something that I think everybody should read. And it's actually a good book, journalistic, but a good book. And then there is the book on totalitarianism, which is an absolute disaster. I mean, it's just systematically wrong about every single point she makes, including folding anti-Semitism into totalitarianism, sort of dismissing the emergence of nationalism as a principle of totalitarianism and fascification. I should tell you guys that I'm not alone. So this is my I'm sorry for this. I know it's not very professional.
It's proof that you are human.
Yes, again. Exactly. So the interesting thing about it is that the idea that she has that somehow nationalism is the antidote, I'm sorry, my English is also floundering, is the antidote to totalitarianism is a complete absurdity, because one of the things that is important to remember about the notion of nationalism in the 17th, 18th, but mainly 18th, 19th century unfolding of the idea is that in the European context in which the idea of nation emerges, nation is essentially the word that is being used, and I think that the historiography to some degree is somewhat clear. No, we're not happy here. The historiography is somewhat clear, is that the idea of nation is very, very close to the idea of ethno-religious or ethno-linguistic group. So what we have in the emergence of nationalism is something that is really quite straightforward, which is the emergence of the idea that the membership in the state is reserved for a national group, that is for an ethno-religious or ethno-linguistic group. So obviously, the moment that you actually amble into, say, Berlin in 1920 or 1890 or 1870, you find yourself basically in the remnant of the capital of the Prussian Empire. And in the Prussian Empire, and I think that this is an argument that I have made many, many times, and I have hoped always that it gets me into trouble, which is that there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that, dirty as it was, imperial colonialism was a morally more acceptable, more tolerable political regime than nationalism. And I can actually tell you two reasons why. The first one is, I don't know how many of you saw Monty Python, The Life of Brian. If you haven't, that's the most important political education that you can receive. They used to ask me if I Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was asked often if I prefer Woody Allen or Monty Python. I like to say that when I was young, I used to like Woody Allen a lot more because I thought it was more intelligent. But I think that as I got older, I realized that Monty Python is much more realistic. That's really how life actually unfolds. In Monty Python, The Life of Brian, there is this conversation about this mocked group of terrorists that are trying to liberate Judea from the Romans. And they're plotting, they're sitting down in some sort of dark recess and figuring out how they're going to attack the Romans. And the leader says, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" And one of the people sitting there goes like, "Well, aqueducts." It's like, okay, well, aqueducts. But then besides that, what have the Romans ever done for us? Then it goes like education. Yeah, fine, education. And the list just keeps kind of coming and growing and growing. And this is a question that I think one has to ask oneself from a position of like an ideological commitment, especially if you come from the left. This is a question that you're not allowed to ask. You're not allowed to ask if there is anything that we can say as adults about colonialism. That is to say, we recognize costs, but we also recognize benefits. This is what adults do. We actually do not paint ourselves like pure moral fields in which here are the evil ones and here are the good ones. So this to me is actually a pretty central one. And I think that this is something that in the Constitution, coming back to what I was to the initial point, which was Hannah Arendt, the construction of the national identity, when you would amble into a place like Berlin or into, say, Vienna, what you would find is that within that empire, you had a multiplicity of nations. In fact, Europe, I mean, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Prussian Empire, and so on and so forth, understood Jews, for instance. I mean, I come from a Jewish family, and to me was always very strange the idea that people would refer to Jews as a nation. But this was actually a legal matter. Jews were a nation the same way that Slavs were a nation. So, you had rights that were allotted to these different national groups within the same state that was a state that was imperial. Now, the problem with nationalism, and I will get over this very, very quickly, I promise, is that... Sorry, guys. The problem with this is that the moment you actually sort of build a national regime, what you end up with is the exclusive membership and the rights become actually the sole monopoly of those that belong to that ethno-linguistic or ethno-religious group. I mean, to me, it doesn't make a difference if this is being done by Buddhists, this is being done by Jews, or this is being done by Catholics. I think that the understanding that I want to think that we fostered over the last 200 years of like bloodletting is that it's never a good idea to actually have sort of a national system that is, a state system that is predicated on the exclusive rights of an ethno-linguistic or ethno-social group. I mean, I think it's funny for me to even say this because I honestly think that these are things that we had completely settled. Okay, now why is it that I'm mentioning this? There is a second element that I think that is worth sort of bringing to the fore in relation to the construction of totalitarianism, which was precisely my point. What is the basic mechanism in the constitution of mechanics of totalitarianism? Sorry. I think that the second element is one that is best understood if we actually look at fascism. And by fascism here, and I want to be very clear about this, I think that those of us which have like a full sort of neuronal operation should resist in every single possible way the utilization of categories like fascism, Nazism, totalitarianism, and so on and so forth, in a way that is non-technical. I mean, Americans really love to use fascism and Nazism. Yesterday I heard a great line, which is that cough also here, which is that when you discuss with Americans history, there is really only one trope, which is the goodness of America, and then the evil of the Nazis. So all of history, Western history, for the sort of from the standard American mind, has this American project, and then the contrast is the Nazi. And it's no surprise. I mean, this is something that I think we should really resist, and we should resist it really, really aggressively. So when I talk about fascism, I'm talking about something very, very specific. As far as I'm concerned, there was only one single experience of fascism, and that is interwar Italy. Nothing else. Nazism was not fascism. Frankism was not fascism. The dictatorship in Argentina was not fascism. Pol Pot was not a fascist. Now, there are proto-fascist elements. There are features that fascism has, because I really do think that it has the most finished articulation of the way in which hardline communitarism, literally the fascification, right? The sort of the aggregation, the fascist is the aggregation of individuals under a collective will or a collective move. I think that there is no better sort of articulation politically and no better implementation than collectivization and totalitarianism in the fascist project of Mussolini. I mean, so to be more specific, it's Mussolini and Gentile. Gentile is the great, really the brains, so to say, behind fascism. And he was called the philosopher of fascism. Interestingly enough, he was a neo-Hegelian, very close to Croce, to Benedetto Croce. They eventually broke from each other. But this gentleman was somebody that had strong sympathies with socialism. I mean, let's not forget that fascism was born inside the Italian Socialist Party. I mean, actually, Mussolini was one of its early leaders. And it remained with a very strong relation with some of the collectivist ideas that operated there. Now, as opposed to what Americans in the right like to say, fascism was a left-wing project, I think that that's absolute nonsense. Fascism was not a left-wing project. Fascism was an absolutely right-wing project, which was completely tied into like the Italian aristocracy and was completely tied into like Italian big industry. And the reason why it took was precisely because Mussolini managed very efficiently to push fascism essentially as an alternative to the revolutionary dispositions that socialists and communists and anarchists to some degrees were presenting as a threat to the aristocracy, to monarchists, and so on. I mean, this just as a parenthesis. The thing that is interesting about fascism, and the reason why I bring it up, it's not simply to show you that I can read these things, which I do and I find a lot of fun, but also because Mussolini and Gentile had a very, very specific account of how the operation would work. And that account is based to a large degree on the principle of totalitarianism. Now, I want to give you a very quick run through on how is it that the idea of totalitarianism emerges. The first appearance of the word totalitarianism was actually a journalist called Giovanni Amendola, who writes against Mussolini. He's a liberal who gets killed by fascists in 22, I want to say, or 23. He's beaten up, I mean, badly by a group actually led by an American fascist who had been come back to the country of their elders. I mean, he was born in the US, if I'm not mistaken. I cannot remember the name. So he's beaten up, he's put in the hospital, sent to France, to Marseille or to Nice, and in Marseille or Nice, he dies a year later from the injuries that he sustained. So what Amendola was doing was looking at 22 provincial elections in which something remarkably interesting happened, which was that the fascist party, which was already configured, went to elections as the majority party and had as its opposition a minority party, which were the liberals. And what the liberals did was actually present themselves as an opposition, but they were actually the partners of the fascists. So when they went into government, the fascists won, but won by a small margin, and they needed the liberals, which were actually the opposition, in principle, the opposition, to actually add votes. What Amendola says when the fascists essentially go out and celebrate their win is to say, look, I mean, this is not a democratic win of the majority. This is not even the minority winning, which was right, because it was the liberals, it was the small liberal party that actually gave them. This is actually a totalitarian. This is a democratic, this is a win of the totality. This is a totalitarian win. Now, Mussolini looks at this, or Gentile looks at this, it becomes a fairly important article, and they respond to this attack by taking up the word and actually spelling it out. Really, Gentile was I think that he was actually a very, very elegant thinker. And what he says is basically this, and you can find this in the Fascist Manifesto, and you can find this in What is Fascism, and so on. What he says is that the fascist project essentially is a project not of establishing the regiment of daily life for the people and the corporations and the institutions of Italy from the top down. What fascism tries to do is to permeate, and this is the turn of phrase that is used, the life of the people. It will begin with the housewife. It will begin with the man that goes to work. It will begin with the children. So fascism will be lived out through the daily performance of all these people. And they talk about permeating the life of the people. So the idea here, and I think that this is the one that I really want to emphasize, is that the rallying cry of fascism is nothing outside of the state. Literally, I mean, this is the phrase, nothing against the state, nothing outside of the state. Not even, and I think that this is the very important thing, is not even any of the internal margin, resquices, little holes, niches, nooks, and crannies that normally will be the place where ideas, where criticism against the preponderance of the state germinate. What do I mean by that? Well, look, I am of the opinion that every time that I'm engaged in a rational decision making for something like crossing the street on a red light, which I know that in Latin America we mostly do it without even thinking. But let's say that you actually see the red light and you think like, well, crap, I mean, I shouldn't, but I'm 20 minutes late. The moment you said, but I'm 20 minutes late, this has been actually a conceptual act of subversion of the law. You have contemplated the possibility of the subversion of the law. And this is something that, although it might in the long run happen in the public sphere, that is to say, you perform this act of subversion, the subversion really takes root in the intimacy of your thoughts. I mean, I'm not talking about like the accident, the thing you did without thinking. Of that, we can discuss at a different point. But I think that Mussolini and Gentile had a very, very efficient answer to that problem. Because, you know, all you need to say is like, well, we're going to educate a population that will never even like contemplate crossing the street on the red light. Much in the way that I think that we can talk about the ethos of crossing, of not paying attention to rules that, you know, that we have germinated in our countries. I think that we can also understand the ethos of following the rules, sort of. I mean, Germans are famous for that. It's a lie. I mean, I live here, but they're famous for this idea of following the rule. That's also an ethos. So one of the things that has been pointed out, and I think very cleverly and very efficiently, is that the fascist project essentially consists in the mutual interpenetration of ethics and politics. Ethics and politics become indistinguishable from each other. And this should be a huge warning to those that really demand ethics in politics. Now, there is a counterpart to this, which is the Gramsci project. The Gramsci project has exactly the same kind of features. And this is the clever thing that has been pointed out, which is what we do. I don't know. I mean, I assume many of you have read Orwell's Animal Farm. I know that now everybody talks 1984, but I think Animal Farm is a better book. In Animal Farm, I hope you do remember what is that Napoleon does when he goes away to basically prepare the rebellion. I mean, prepare the destruction of what's the name of the other pig? I think it's Butterball. No, it's not. Well, something like that. So what he does is he goes away. This pig, Napoleon, goes away, and what he takes are the puppies. He takes the puppies off the farm, and they disappear. And by the time they come back, the puppies are no longer puppies. They're like mastiffs. And the first thing that happens is that the hens decide that because of the regiment, they will not lay eggs anymore. And the mastiffs, at a single sign, at a single expression of Napoleon, they jump on the hens and rip them apart. So this is the reason why we pay attention to the question of indoctrination. But the point I think that is more important is that what Orwell is pointing to there is the importance of establishing the ethos, the political ethos of not a people, of a generation. A generation is really the building block in this conception of the political architecture and the political engineering. Momo, un minuto. This is very interesting. Okay, so I say that myself. So why is it that I'm mentioning this? I think that at this point should be more or less clear where is that I'm trying to get and what is the space that I think that we need to look to preserve, right? I mean, what I'm actually interested in is not in the rebellion, in the act of rebellion that we normally think of as the act of rebellion. I'm not interested in the right to actually take up a Molotov and run down the street. I think that a completely different machine, I mean, a conceptual machine is at play in the throwing of the Molotov. The throwing of the Molotov has necessarily to be an act of criminality. But the point is that that act of criminality is a wager, which, right or wrong, it consists in the following calculation, as far as I'm concerned. The degree of injustice is such that the criminal attack on the state to revert this injustice is justified. And that justification is the justification that is moral, it's not a political justification. The political justification, as far as I'm concerned, belongs in the polity. And that means that I realize that what I'm about to do in throwing the Molotov is criminal. That's a political realization, but I still do it. And that doing is moral. This would be my claim. Now, what we have in this case is the space of rebellion that is not criminal. And it's the one that needs to be protected, not only from the attacks, not only from sort of repression and so on, but it has to be protected from its conversion into a statute. Much in the way in which Marxism likes to talk about commodification, I think that it is important that we think about statusization. Essentially, that means the conversion of values or activities of thought that have no legal standing into something with a legal standing. So this process, which grabs something that does not belong in the framework of the law, being pushed into the framework of the law, in the particular case of these stories that I was telling you about, like nationalism, and I will go back to nationalism in a minute to close my talk, but I mean, in the context of Italian fascism, in the context of different forms of absolutism, particularly when there is an absolutism that is totalitarian. So this is not like, well, anyway, an absolutism that is totalitarian in the context of Argentinian repression, in the context of Brazilian military dictatorships, and so on and so forth. There was the question about the space of what is really just in the family of thought, the conceptual project. We extend, and I think that we rightly do that we draw the limit right there at expression. We recognize it as expression as essentially a translation of the life of the mind. But we also recognize that expression has the capacity to produce incitement. And American law, for instance, draws the line of freedom of expression at incitement. I can say things like, you know, I can write like the Marquis de Sade, but I cannot go out and say, well, start hunting out girls in the streets and submit them to our awful tortures for your pleasure. This I cannot do, because that is actually incitement. That is not just the endorsement of the act, but that is actually the demand of the act. Now, incitement is itself a very strange animal, so I mean, it's worthwhile perhaps going through it. But I think that the point that I want to make here is that what we have, I think, understood in 300 years of building up a sort of a solid account of the place of enlightenment in, say, our conceptual economy, in our process of literacy, in the construction of scientific knowledge, in the improvement of our rights is something that belongs essentially to the realization that the conceptual act of rebellion that has happened in asking the critical question, and I mean, for those of you who are philosophers, essentially, I'm not really doing anything else here than, extremely convoluting Kant's What is Enlightenment. All I'm doing here is essentially suggesting to you that the space of criticism, that is the place in which you sort of willfully step away from your willful childishness, right? This is what he talks about, like sort of willful childishness is sort of the contrary of enlightenment. That's what we have to overcome. This space is, sorry, this is my computer again, is the space of criticism. And that space of criticism is not something that I think it's conceptually massive, that requires sort of something, sorry, once again, it's not something that requires sort of a massive amount of articulation in a philosophically complex way. No, I'm talking here about, should I cross the street with the red light? That's what I'm talking about. That space, the contemplation of the subversion, is a space that I do not want to repress. But most importantly, I do not want to turn into a statute. I do not want to give a juridical statute, because then it becomes fodder for criminalization. And the entire point about this is not only penetrating the life of the people, as Gentile and Mussolini put it, and as so efficiently, I mean, the Argentine dictatorship, the Brazilian dictatorship, the Uruguayans, and so on did, but the point is not even opening the door to that. So, okay, so one of my biggest pet peeves is the woke machine, which I call Wokistan, and the name of the book on which I'm working, and I'll be happy to send you my first chapter, is called The Last Progressive of Wokistan. I don't know if I'm a progressive, but I certainly feel that I'm one of the last in this family in Wokistan, in a place which keeps advancing and sort of keeps taking dogmatic root among us. I am not ready, and I want to be very clear about this. I am not ready to forbid them, criminalize them, or actually even urge like the state to go and look at what is that they're thinking. This is precisely what I don't want to do. What I want them to do is to actually put these ideas out in the open. And then what I want to do is have the fight, because I love having the fight, as Marta very well knows. I love having the fight, but I think that the important thing is that it is that space that gives us the opening for the confrontation of the ideas. And just to tie it together, this question that I ask myself, should I cross the street in a red light, which is an act of conceptual rebellion, is actually the same one that then in the confrontation with the Wokistan mullahs actually becomes a possibility of criticism. The one in which I can ask the question, and here is where nationalism comes into play for me. Isn't your game of sort of nativism, isn't your game of cultural purity and authenticity, where only Caetano Veloso has actually the right to play with pandeiro? Anybody that was born outside Bahia only gets guitars. And not even that, because the guitars really, I mean, should be only reserved for essentially Central Asia. Not even the Arabs. The oud is actually too late a development. I mean, only people that are black can play black people. Only people that are Jews can write about Jewish people. So on and so forth, and so on and so forth. Now, two things to draw your attention to. The first one is the account that stands at the very core of the Wokistani machine is, as a matter of fact, an account of national purity. Not in the way that we understand it in Brazil or Argentina or the US or Peru, where the nation is synonym of the state. I'm talking about the way in which nation in terms of natio, the place of birth, the tribe, the place where I am just sitting there with my five relatives, and we all speak. We don't even need language, because we can just moan at each other, and we all have the same color, and we all basically have the same ideas. We have exactly the same diet. So this kind of purity is a purity which reserves not only the act I mean, the Pandeiro point was not a joke. I mean, I have been very much privy to huge fights about Paul Simon Rhythm of the Saints, which is an album that I love, because it basically, deploys Brazilian sounds without like basically being Brazilians. So samba and choro only for Brazilians. Can you imagine what an absolutely sad world that would be? What an absolutely depressing life we would have. I mean, when Cosimo was born, the first thing that happened, maybe it's a bit intimate, but the first thing that happened is that I picked him up immediately, a minute and a half, and I started singing Chega de Saudade, because it was a song that for me instinctively was huge in my house. Everybody sang this thing, and somehow I wanted to calm him, and this was the first thing that came. Imagine that I were deprived of that because I was born south of Iguazu. What madness! What kind of madness is this? Right? So the point is, this access to those possibilities is essentially a re-articulation of a form of nationalism, which I find thoroughly pernicious. And here is the second takeout, or the second upshot of this. What we're being asked not to do by this sort of political machine, which is a very reactionary machine, presents itself at the left. I don't know if it's the left. What we're actually being asked to do is not to actually avoid crimes of outrage against others. We're not being told like the problem is, the racial slur. The problem is not like going out and enslaving somebody or depriving somebody of freedom or like sort of degrading them in their sort of, no, what we're being asked to do is not to commit crimes of consciousness and expression. And this is what I find extremely, extremely pernicious, because what it pulls back is to two threads that I think are remarkable to find in what had been the children that only found a space. I mean, everybody that now is engrossing the lines of Wokistan, left-wing Jews, like left-wing blacks, left-wing homosexuals, left-wing like transgender, all of these people that only have found a safe space in the public sphere to express their politics, precisely because we were not actually any more persecuted for crimes of conscience and making use of ideas that were not actually allowed to us. We were given that space. We Jews were given that space. My best friend in Canada, an homosexual Jew, was given that space precisely by this project, which is we do not give essentially a standard of juridical approval to our thoughts and our dispositions in intimacy. Now, okay, so just to summarize, and I promise this is the last, I don't know for how long I talk, but the point here is this. The point is, the basic operation, not of fascism is bigger than what I described, but the basic operation of totalitarianism is very nicely described in the fascist project. And that is nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. And what that means, and I want to be clear about this, is not the repression of the Molotov cocktail throwing anarchist who is 22 years old. No, it's actually the foreclosing of the thought that is against the state. It's the spirit, in the spiritual activity of the citizen. Excuse me for this is a bit of a Gallicism. I mean, the French love spirit. The spirit of the individual, not even there should there be opposition to the state. When the most important word in that formulation, the Gentile Mussolini formulation, is nothing. When they mean nothing against the state, what they actually meant was nothing. Okay, now just to end it, the note of optimism that I can offer you is that fascism essentially met its match, not in the American entrance, and not in the collapse of support for Mussolini. Fascism met its match in the Italian temperament. Essentially, the fact is that there was something, I mean, and I say this partly joking, partly seriously. I think that there is no project politically that is as spurious, as absurd as trying to regiment every single minute of the life of an Italian. And I can say that because I come from Buenos Aires, and I can say that because I spent a lot of time in Italy and I do a lot of work with Italy. I mean, in some sense, the ethos of the nation or the ethos of the people was no match for this rearticulation. And I think that in that sense, looking forward, I think that we can be quite optimistic that this is actually a moment, but it's a moment that, in my estimation, will not necessarily last. Okay, I will stop there. I don't know for how long I spoke, but I'm sorry if it was very long.
No, Martin, we could listen to you for several more hours.
You say that because you're a friend, but there are other people there that
No,
can correct you on that.
I'm pretty confident that I dare to speak for those who are present, and I'm sure that they will be like to listen to you.
That's very kind, Maria Isabel. I have actually a 2.5-year-old here who completely disagrees with you. But okay.
Well, but that's wonderful, Martin. So let's have some questions. I may start. I may start, or if somebody wants to start as well, please raise your hand. Levanta a mãozinha. Se quiserem já colocar alguma questão. Se não, otherwise, I may go first with a reflection on the. I think you just pointed to one of the most crucial challenges that we have ahead of us, which is looking at the world and realizing that there's something very wrong happening. I mean, I wonder, is that how did we get here? After it's like we haven't learned much with history, and it seems like this enlightenment or this critical movement actually turned against itself by exactly promoting promoting the exactly opposite of what is meant, which is the refusal of reason, the refusal of thought, the refusal of pluralism in the sense of the meeting with the others, with the different, and the refusal, even more dangerous, it's an actual refusal of the common, of the common world, because it's and I think that one of the points that you sharply described is the Wokistan and the wokeism movement, between quotation marks, expresses this, it seems to me, the anxiety of like the meaning of existence, but because there is no meaning, because we had the conditions for plurality and the freedom of expression and of thought and association and so forth, this suddenly becomes a movement of postulating a new kind of like answering the anxiety, the existential anxiety, finding it in a reinvention of tribalism and so forth. Everything is imminent. So like we are absolutely we want to reconceptualize a feeling of belonging by criticizing, not in the sense of an exercise of reason or reasoning, but as destroying all references of our history, tradition, and past, collective past. So this tribalism or this tribal impulse that aims at this, as you said, cultural purity, which is doomed from the start. It's absolutely doomed from the start. So the only possible end for this movement is an implosion of everything that was actually built in history. Starting by the question of thought and thought. And the other thing that I wanted to strengthen and underline that I thought right at the end that you mentioned, which is, it's very interesting to see, especially in the past 2 years, but not only. I mean, this has been a crescendo, that so-called democratic states have been including and expanding and becoming more total in the sense of accounting and legislating for all spheres of life. So there is hardly any space for freedom in a Hobbesian sense, that citizens are free when the law is silent. So the law now speaks about everything, including, and I'll just mention an example, which is in Brazil, that it's quite that it's quite strange. Not only does the several democratic states want to account for all spheres of human existence, so there is this totalitarian ethos being accentuated in the democratic horizon, and we see it clearly when today we are observing. We observed for the past year and a half the suspension of the most basic freedoms. It's like, oh, this is just an accessory. It doesn't matter. What matters is the health of the political body and the population and so forth. So in parallel, we have this wokeist infiltration that aims to censor and to cancel everything that defies his own position. So actually, it's the example of the negation of liberalism, right? So it's like we have democracy, but we absolutely deny liberalism because you are not free to think otherwise. You are only free to think as I or as we tell you that you should.
Yeah.
And you should talk as we decide. So there, of course, there is an intrinsic relationship between the spiritual activity that actually is the most basic element of resistance to control, to state control and language. And that's why there is this irrational movement of trying to abolish language and transform language in a sense that there is no space for logic or reasoning.
I mean,
right?
I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, and finally, just to give you an example, although there are two levels. There is this criminalization of thought and expression. We see it very clearly with this tendency to cancel not only speeches, but actually in universities we see it. Many professors that are resigning because they cannot tolerate, they cannot live anymore in the environment of the negation of their own principles for their activity. So there is this public sphere also between quotation marks, because that would be another discussion. But in Brazil, we already have concrete examples of people being criminalized and being arrested and being thrown into jail for several months for crime of opinion. I mean, there is no law that can criminalize your thoughts. However, thoughts and expression and language is being criminalized. And the shocking is not only that, because there is no one else to appeal, because the ones that are doing this are exactly the ones that are on top of the pyramid of power. The shocking and very scary thing is that is not only democratic institutions do not work because they are totally dysfunctional, so they don't even resist to the progressive and crescent exercises of tyranny by criminalizing thought and expression, as most of the people or a part of the population that has a public representation in the public sphere applaud it. So you have traditional media that are voicing and strengthening the acts of tyranny, not even thinking that they can be next. They will be silent, and it starts by silencing the voice and then by arresting the body, and we don't know the end of this because there's no guarantee that when you discover that you have no more freedom, it's too late.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think you're right, mostly right. In any case, I mean, I think that the question of trivialization. So that was your first point. The question of trivialization is quite remarkable, but I think that it's important to say that it's not new, and I think that it's also important to point out that the biggest challenges to enlightenment have come from nowhere else than from enlightenment. I mean, it's not that, this is always enlightenment shooting at itself from the flanks.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's not that we have, a large part of my work is Vatican politics. It's not the Vatican that is actually pushing, reactionary political positions. I mean, with friends like the woke machine, who needs the Vatican? I mean, so the point, I think the point to be made is that it is enlightenment in a variety of guises. One of them is forgetting its history, is people that what my uncle used to call the illness of a full belly, is, or what they call here luxury problems.
Exactly.
Luxury problems is essentially not knowing, I mean, not only how good you have it, but then having no sense of how is it that this was my point about, all these people that now demand the suppression of ideas when the only reason why they have the rights. And I count myself among them as having the rights, So, I mean, I think that it's important not to be too teary-eyed about like enlightenment. I mean, enlightenment has always produced this, right? I mean, I think that a book that I recommend strongly to everybody, I was asked yesterday in a different conference about books recommended, is The Gods Are Thirsty, or The Gods Have Thirst by Anatole France. This is a very short book. It should not be confused. Apparently, there was some woman in England that wrote a really crappy romantic novel with the same name in the 90s, which is stole from Anatole France. Anatole France was a Nobel Prize in literature. It's a very short book about the terror after the French Revolution. And it deals, I mean, the most interesting character there is one named Brutot, who is a former aristocrat that was an atheist and a bit of a bon vivant. So he liked a lot of things that the old regime didn't, and he did not get along with the church and so on. And he was really sort of very amicable to the revolutionary position until he finds himself with, Robespierre and the rest of them sort of chopping the heads of everybody they can find. And so I think that this is a book that one should check out precisely because it shows in the most spectacular way. I mean, he really describes the construction or the reconstruction of dogma in the children of what the French call Jean-Jacques, right? I mean, the Rousseauian inheritors were animals. I mean, they were not nice people because, so I don't think we should be too teary-eyed. I think that this is actually the history of enlightenment. And I think that it is what comes with really, it's the price of accepting that we need to tolerate ugly ideas. So this was my point. Now, I think that the second point is about tolerance. And I think that to me, this is kind of a central issue. I mean, one of the things that emerged from my my youth in the Argentinian violent sort of landscape, I mean, as I was coming of age, was the idea of the importance of tolerance. And I think that what we need to keep in mind is that nobody feels the need to be tolerant to things that they like. I don't need to be tolerant of, the ideas that I love and the things that I find wonderful. Tolerance is basically the test of force of my maturity and the test of force of my resilience in the face of things that I don't like. And I think that, to me, it's very clear that the talk of fragility and protecting fragility is absolute madness. It's absolute madness from a civic point of view. It's absolute madness from a political point of view. I mean, we don't educate our children protecting their fragility. We educate our children to develop resilience, to develop patience, to develop the capacity to deal with tedium, sort of go through processes that are not always pleasant. This is absolutely important. This is what makes us sort of full human beings. So I think that one of the important elements is that tolerance has become actually somehow a bad word, which is extremely, extremely problematic. And then the last point you make is one that, yes, there is no easy way out of this, precisely, I mean, because on the one hand, we do have, the kind of republicanism that somebody like Bolsonaro would present, and make no mistake about it, it is republicanism. Bolsonaro is not Franco. I mean,
No.
So
Liberal.
Yeah, exactly. So you have a kind of liberal republicanism with certain ideas about the freedom of the market and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, you have people that, this is a point I referred to this again, but I also made yesterday, which was, I was discussing with somebody that grew up in the Soviet Union, and they were telling me, well, the Soviet Union, so and so and so. And what I was saying is like, look, the point here is that if you ask me about my history, what I will tell you is that all these bastards that were pulling the toenails and like electrocuting people and throwing them out of airplanes, they were actually coming under the guise of like Chicago economic theory, supported by like DC. I mean, the point here is that what you experience in the Soviet Union and what I experience might actually change in terms of ideological content, but formally, and this is a reason why, I mean, this talk was about the formal construction of totalitarianism, not about the ideological construction of totalitarianism. You can put inside totalitarianism whatever the hell you want. You can make sure that there is nobody in your entire country that will actually dream of putting pineapple on a pizza. And the moment you actually make that it doesn't really matter. The point is, not only you will forbid and you will kill people that eat that, you will actually put in jail people that prepare it, and then you will make sure to educate people all the way to like the household to like negate the possibility of pineapple on pizza. It doesn't really matter what you do in it. The point is, the totalitarian machine is a formal one, and this is why I think you correctly see the parity of what you see in the space of essentially the space of the state, which is incompetent, which is incapable, which is, and the Wokistan machine, which is the one that actually shares completely the intuitions of how the politics should work.
Yeah.
It's just that they do it with another ideological content, but that doesn't really matter. I mean, just look, there is an important piece of information. As I said, Mussolini was the right, and it was the radical right that was ready actually to like ship Jews and ship homosexuals out into concentration camps. But he hanged in 1941, he hanged in Piazzale Loreto, upside down, not only with his lover and so on and so on, but he also hanged right next to Bombaci. Now, most of you would not know who Bombaci was. Bombaci remained a friend and was killed with Mussolini and hung upside down in Piazzale Loreto, and he was the founder of the Communist Party of Italy. So, I mean, the point is, the ideological position of these two men were not the same.
Yes.
I mean, Mussolini was a rabid anti-communist. But there was something that they clearly understood about each other. Not only they had been friends for a very long time, but they also understood that there was something about the technique of the movement of ideological process and the ethification of the body politics. So where this comes from, I mean, that is a much longer discussion. I think that where it comes from in places like Brazil, in places like Argentina. I mean, in Argentina now, I don't know if this is happening in Brazil in the same form, but people are not talking about so trabajadora o trabajador. What they put is trabajadore. So
yes, in Brazil, they want to force this neutral language.
Right, exactly. So the point is, I just want to make this point very quickly because I know that there are people that want to ask questions, but this is something that is not only absurd, but is essentially a direct attack on the very constitution of the language. So Portuguese is essentially a binomial language, as is Spanish, as is German is trinomial, because we have a very strong in German, a very strong neuter. Now, the idea of the neutralization is something that is completely germane to English. So the interesting thing about like a lot of these Wakistanis running around in Argentinian or Brazilian or Peruvian universities is that they are in fact missionaries, or if you prefer, colonialist of sorts, for an American project without even thinking it, and actually not even having any contemplation other than essentially a condemnation, because obviously if you speak Spanish in the old way, you must be a chauvinist, a pig, an apologist for rape, and so on, a misogynist, and so on and so forth, right? This is really just the translation of an American political project into a Latin American context without thinking it, but in a way that is extremely, extremely aggressive and reminiscent of the forms of evangelism and missionary work in colonial times. So
exactly.
Anyway, we can go on with that, but I think that Vanderson has maybe a question. But yeah, sorry.
Can I talk?
Yes.
Oh, first, thank you, Professor Martin. I'm sorry for get so late and for losing your most part of your presentation. I woke up 30 minutes ago. I would like to...
I feel honored.
About the fascism. Hitler raised to power, making part of the German Socialist Party. But many people say he is from extreme right. His political position was from extreme right. Although he has raised to power through making part of the socialism party.
Vanderson, se você quiser fazer a pergunta em português, tá bem também, hein?
Ah, o senhor fala português? Tudo bem.
Pouquinho.
Então, o Hitler chegou ao poder fazendo parte do Partido Socialista Alemão, mas muita gente diz que ele é de extrema direita.
Ok, vou contestar, vou responder em inglês. I think, this is something that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So two things. The first one is that I don't see Nazism as fascism. So Nazism is not fascism, it's Nazism. And what I was saying, and I'll just say it again, is that as far as I'm concerned, fascism is really just a project that happens in Italy in the interwar period. Nothing else is fascism. Other things have elements of fascism, but they're not fascism.
Fascism.
Sorry?
Nazism wasn't fascism.
Exactly. So that's my point. Nazism wasn't fascism. The second thing to be said is that Nazism had very strong proto-fascist elements. But Nazism, as opposed to fascism, had a much stricter ideological position. Now, Hitler did not come to power in the Socialist Party. What Hitler came to power in was in the workers' Social Party of Germany. And this is actually quite a different animal. And as a matter of fact, the contrast can best be seen by his relation to the socialist and two types of socialists, to the labor socialism, which was essentially gremialistas, and his relation to the socialist, which were Marxist socialists. of different sorts, including people like the Spartakists, who were a bit farther to the left, but also, so he was really not a socialist. And the thing that is very interesting about the Hitler arrival to power is that his base are essentially, to a very large degree, are former combatants, former fighters from the First World War, as he was himself. So there is a lot of this, what in Argentina we used to call after the military dictatorship, mano de obra desocupada. I don't know if that's understandable in Portuguese, but that is labor that has lost their job. So that was the sort of the repression machine that no longer was employed in repression, and now they were hired for different things. So the thing that is particular about Hitler is that, and the Nazi Party, is that the march into the labor union machine that became one of their sort of bases of the construction of the political apparatus was actually fighting and killing many of the people that were part of not only the Socialist Party, but were part of the trade unions, of the gremios. As a matter of fact, I mean, the first concentration camp in Germany is 5 blocks from where I'm talking to you, and it was a water tower in Kolwitzplatz, and it was only used for socialists and communists. So there was nobody else in there. I think that the point with Hitler, I mean, the right or the left, is that I think that, as far as I'm concerned, quite honestly, this is just a political, it's part of a political debate that doesn't concern me. I mean, as from an historical point of view, I think that there is absolutely not even a shadow of a doubt that Hitler belongs to the far right. And you can see, the discussions, and you can see the speeches, and you can read through like the propaganda, the construction of his political system. So, my qualm is, I don't think that there is anything at stake here. I don't think that socialism is better or worse because Hitler read Marx, and I don't think that fascism is better or worse because Mussolini read Marx, or because he was influenced Hitler was influenced by the Thule Society. All right. I mean, this doesn't really make a difference. I mean, to me, in any case, I don't know if that responded.
Which philosopher are we? Which philosopher are we working with?
I didn't understand, sorry.
Com qual filósofo nós estamos trabalhando? Ou we are working with your own ideas, Professor?
Which philosophy?
Which philosophy?
Vanderson is asking if you have in mind a specific philosopher, but
yes.
Well, I mean, I have in mind many. I mean, and I don't know in what particular regard. I mean, in the question of Hitler's sort of ascent to power, this is really just, historical sources, essentially, and I mean, a lot of the available stuff. In terms of philosophy, I think that I would say that probably for me, one of the things that define my outlook is very likely, I mean, Heidegger with a lot of Kant, or Kant with a lot of Heidegger. These are the places where these are the first things that I smoked, so to say. But I mean, there are many. I wrote my dissertation on Levinas, and I did an enormous amount of Christian philosophers from the 1st to the 5th century. So I mean, Saint Augustine, for instance, Saint Augustine is very, very important for me, and remains still today extremely important for me.
Because you talked about enlightenment, so I thought you were working with some philosopher of the Enlightenment, like Kant or Hume.
Well, like a late Enlightenment, certainly. I mean, Hume for me was also sort of very important. But I think that what I was thinking mostly was, I was talking about Kant's What is Enlightenment? But, a lot of the discussion was really around ideas probably that are in principle Rousseauian ideas. So Rousseau and sort of people that come out of the Rousseau tradition. I mean, I think that that's kind of the space. But I mean, there are tons of those. So I mean, I think that Voltaire becomes also very important. I think that Heine. I mean, for me, sort of the letters the letters on the aesthetic education of man from Schiller are extremely, extremely important politically. I read Plato's Symposium as actually a central book for an Enlightenment project. But I think that I am less. I have not been part of academia in 10 years, and I think that I have become less and less worried and less interested in authors. I have tried to liberate myself from the names of the authors and their books. I hope that they come with me, and sometimes I probably betray them. It's not on purpose, but I also feel that I'm 47, so I give myself kind of the right to think sometimes away from them. I don't know if there are any other questions. Or
Plato's Symposium is that little test where
Yes.
he talks about Eros.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is basically a movement. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's basically a movement from the question of knowledge, right? From ignorance to knowledge. And that movement has to be guided by something that pulls you. And the question is what pulls you, and Plato's essentially, this is my interpretation of the text. But Plato's basic stand, and I think it's one that you find in Schiller, 2,000 years later, is the idea that in the end, that thing that pulls you is beauty. And beauty can find representations in the very mundane. You can find beauty in things that are like a picture. You can find beauty in a monument or a leaf of grass. And then you kind of move up the ranks. You see your wife or your boyfriend, and then you see your child, and then there is a sense that you realize that, well, it cannot be inherent in matter. And this is where the soul kind of leaps and looks beyond the material in order to try to account for what is that is pulling me. But what Plato does, and I think he does it effectively in my mind, is to show you that there is a continuum, and that continuum might not be something that you can point out outside, but when you look at yourself and how you're pulled in these directions. And I think that that's an important thing in terms of understanding, for instance, my rejection of tribalism. My sense of being pulled by beauty is not limited. As a matter of fact, it's not limited at all. And it's betrayed, if anything, by my tribal context. I don't listen just to tango and I play football. Of course, Maradona was better than Pelé. This is obvious, but that's not the point. The point, okay, thank you for laughing at that one. But the point is that, when I'm deeply moved by things, there is a song about sirens that a student of mine from Estonia gave me as a pop song that I loved. I couldn't understand a single bloody word of the song, but there is something about it that pulls on me. I don't know if it's the harmony. I don't know what it is. Now, that to me is something that I cannot say, well, beauty's out there sitting somewhere in the song. There is something in me that is being pulled through all these experiences. And I think that in this sense, that book, The Symposium, to me, is more important than the Republic, it's more important than the Phaedrus, it's more important than the Phaedo, it's more important than the Meno. Of all of them, if you ask me, what do I need to read in Plato? I would say, get the Symposium and let the other ones sit there for a while. Anyway, sorry, that was another very long response.
Why do you prefer Maradona if you aren't from South America?
No, I just really don't like football. It's the reason why I think that they would want to burn my passport. They will take away my passport.
People murder other people here in Brazil if they say such a thing.
This is why I live in Germany.
You're too far. You're too far.
Well, you never know, but yes, I hope so. I think that this is actually also sort of a really remarkable thing, right? Because when you think about that discussion, Maradona-Pelé, is a discussion that essentially is a tribal discussion. My brother, I really don't like football, but my brother was a professional football player. And, there was at least one episode in which I remember him specifically showing me Pelé in 1970. It was very difficult for me because I couldn't stand football, and I still can't. But he was showing me Pelé in 1970. And he was showing me like a play. And I will not say that he was crying, but he was really kind of trying to explain to me something that was almost like ballet. He was almost showing me something about the movement of this man that was, and for a moment at least, I had the sense of, okay, there is something here that goes way, way beyond the idea of tribal, the idea of tribal commitment. This was this guy just really seeing beauty in Pelé moving through that field. So I think that this is kind of what I'm referring to, is the Argentine that sits there with the history of football in Argentina and Brazil, looks at Pelé, has absolutely no sense of the color or the nationality or like the space, and still is deeply moved by the beauty of that movement, which is not attached to a nationality, it's not attached to a color, it's not attached to a flag. It's really just, there is something in it. And Agnes Heller, which both Marta and I loved, Agnes, I consider her essentially my intellectual mother, and she died actually 2019. Agnes used to talk about the integrity. I mean, literally the integrity, the dignity and the integrity of the work of art. And her idea, in my understanding of that text, which I discussed a lot with a very good friend, is that once the work of art really, the work of art only, its dignity and integrity is only respected when you are fully moved by the work of art and you don't even realize what you have in front, kind of thing. It's the Kandinsky moment, right, of coming into the studio and finding his work upside down and then thinking, who did that? And realizing that it was his work that had been inverted the night before he left. It's like there is beauty that pulls you. There is beauty that pulls you in the play by Pelé, or there is beauty that pulls you in like a smile, or there is beauty that pulls you in a way that it doesn't depend on the thing at all. The thing is not there. And I think that a lot of my problem with precisely the Wokistani and the far right and the far left and so is that it demands that you enjoy only insofar as it is the right color of the guy, it is the right nationality of the guy, it is the right language of the guy. And I refuse that. I don't like things because they are Brazilian, or I don't like things because they are Argentinian. I don't like things because they're German. I mean, it's nonsense. It's completely crazy. Anyway.
It's very interesting that in the United States, football is mostly played with the hands, no?
Well, yeah.
Brazilian football is called soccer in the United States. No?
Yes.
And we truly play football using mostly the feet.
Yeah. I know. We call it football as well. It seems just to be an American passion to call things what they are not. So if you put with the hands, call it football. Okay, so I don't know for how long we've been on this, but
wonderful, Martin.
Are there more questions? Is there anything else that I can do for?
I think we are satisfied.
Okay. Fantastic.
I thank you for your contribution. I think that the underlying message, if I could resume, is that this concern of understanding the form of totalitarianism that may escape, that may have different ideological appearances.
Sure.
And once you grasp that, you're in a much better position to make a realistic diagnosis of what's going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you so much, Martin.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. And if you have any questions, you can certainly send them to me. I mean, find me on Twitter or Facebook or one of those places.
Wonderful. So I'll see you soon.